And now the time you've all been waiting for. Felicia, it's an honor to have you here this morning.
I keep revising, but I'm going to try to stick to in my head as stick to this. So I won't speak for hours, so you will all have time to talk amongst yourselves and/or ask me questions. But meanwhile, I'm going to write down one word I thought of. There we go. All right. Okay. It's kind of lecture-y to begin. So Stephen Hawking, the physicist who has explained so much to us about the black hole, was interviewed recently on Science Friday, one of my favorite shows. One question posed asked him if he would follow the same career path if he had to do it all over again. He said no. He wished he had realized the importance of the revelation of the double helix when he started college in 1957. If he could do it all over again, he said he would study molecular biology, the science of life. Late in life, he's become quite curious about the origins of life. I think we all do in our own ways and explore those origins in various ways. I have. DNA, which I will say is deoxyribonucleic acid, and I've only had biology 101. I have to give you that disclaimer from the start, and also had evolutionary biology, 2 biologies a long time ago. Chromosomes that carry genetic information are made mostly of DNA and proteins, with proteins fueling the DNA. Each of us has 23 chromosomes consisting of billions of base pairs that mingle in different ways. The coding of single nucleotide polymorphism, SNPs, which are really the heart of any DNA test we might do, allow scientists to distinguish between one genome and another. An SNP or SNP can allow scientists to look at turning points in ancestry and evolution, as well as health trends and risk within and across cultures, or something like that. It's quite complicated, and as I said, I'm not a scientist, and I'm still learning. For more information on all this, I recommend Genome, the Autobiography of a Species in 23 chapters by Matt Ridley, a book that I've been reading and studying, among other texts, since I took a simple home DNA test. The test that I took isolated autosomal chromosomes, a genetic mix of both parents. Mix that is more easily sorted if your parents are alive and take the test too, but it is fascinating enough even if they are not. Knowing something about my past already made it easier for me to sort out all the information about health and ancestry in my report. We grow up with so many stories about family traits, health crises, hair color, personalities, professions, mental illness, cancer. Whenever we go to the doctor, we do a family tree. It helps us and doctors to sort out behavioral choices in the face of possible outcomes. The possibilities reside in part in our chromosomes. Damage to DNA, either environmental or genetic or both, can cause mutations and illness and all sorts of things. But biology is not only destiny, I want to say. I've seen that idea laid out, or we have seen that idea laid out in study after study. Nurture and nature go hand in hand. A recent book that I learned about, of course, through Science Friday that I'm reading, that addresses the issue of nature versus nurture is James Fallon's The Psychopath in Me. Fallon reflects on how a person with a brain with clearly psychopathic wiring, avoided becoming a psychopath because of, among other things, a richly nurturing home environment that snipped the genetic wiring instead of tripping it. Anybody staring at a health report on a DNA test needs to keep Fallon's parable in mind. My DNA results arrived about 6 weeks after I spit into a test tube, including information about health traits and risk as well as ancestry. I'll talk about health first. My advice for others who might do such a test is to realize that what you see when you look at all those statistics associated with health risk is not a to-do list. Most people do not get every single health issue their chromosomes foreshadow, and yet the information can be useful, perhaps as useful as family stories. The two need to go hand in hand whenever possible. Science and statistics fascinate me, but stories pass things on as much as DNA does. Thus, my DNA profile did not hold too many surprises. In some cases, it gave me words or clinical terms for hunches and insights. Traits such as eye color, episodic memory skills, and verbal reasoning were already fairly evident in my life trajectory. I know without a test that I'm more sensitive to caffeine, or that sometimes the weight of the world falls too heavy on my shoulders. I have lots of, this is where I revise, I have lots of, I guess, something traits that have taught me to become who I am all by myself, DNA aside, probably innate. One of my favorite traits revealed there is effectively learns to avoid errors. Well, in some cases, not all. Looking at my profile thus is pretty much like looking into a mirror and seeing not just me, but my brothers and my parents and various aunts and grandparents and relatives I've never met but heard about over time. Oh, look, I thought, there's John Henry's Hodgkin's disease. That's my brother who got cancer and died at 21. That was the saddest thing I saw. Oh, look, I thought, there's my great aunt's alcoholism, and not just her alcoholism. And there's my father, here and here and here. So clearly my father that I know I must be his daughter as much as I must be my mother's child, because there is my mother, there and there and there. So I'll pause and say, late in life, because of Parkinson's effect on his brain, my father developed a pretty elaborate delusion that I was not his daughter. I knew I was, and he did deep inside, yet this delusion unsettled me and planted a seed that got me sort of confused. It's the main reason I took the DNA test, in fact, to see if I could find him there inside my chromosomes. I did. Even though I don't have his chromosomes to test. Finding out about health risk and ancestry was a bonus of taking the test. When a parent has a debilitating disease, you may wonder if you are wired like me when it will be your turn. Sometimes you worry. I've never worried so much about Parkinson's because I see it as doable, and I know that very often it's more nurture than nature. It was not always easy for my father, and not always pleasant, but he lived with it with great courage. If I ever get it, I will too, I hope, although I have a chromosome marker that makes me statistically less likely to get Parkinson's disease, though I still could. I have worried more about Alzheimer's disease, which you all know my mother had. The test results for that came with a virtual box that I could unlock to see if I carried a genotype profiled in some studies as a marker for an increased risk for late-onset Alzheimer's disease. Many choose not to know and are frank about not wanting to open that box. I did. Before I checked the box, I read disclaimers, though, and advice, including advice to seek medical advice should I find something upsetting. Alzheimer's can be upsetting or scary, but I've been reading about it and living with it and other people for decades. And so I faced that fear and opened the box, which made me feel courageous. Because sometimes I just don't, I understand not wanting to know. I'm glad that I took the opportunity to look at this report. Seeing that I did not have a particular genotype associated with the sort of Alzheimer's older folks can get made me giddy with happiness for just a few days. It made me realize as well that I had not fully admitted to myself what a burden the worry of the disease had given to me until it lifted a bit in the heels of recovering from chemo brain, which scared me even more in the context of my mother's dementia. This little report relieved a burden on my heart and maybe in my head that made me let out a breath I'd been holding for far too long. Of course, to return to the notion of nature and nurture and my above average intelligence according to the DNA test, I am not naive. I know that I could end up with Alzheimer's disease. Even so, Alzheimer's disease is something about which I know a lot. Everybody has some garden variety risk, with other factors increasing or decreasing this risk. Scientists are learning more about genes every day. Anything is possible. And this complicated disease, as do others, depends on so many variables, environmental and biological. And of course, I know even if I don't get this type of dementia, there are many others. And so I could worry myself sick. We could worry ourselves sick or not. So what if I could let go of one worry or some worries? How might life feel if I if I was not carrying the weight of wondering just how soon I would end up forgetting South Carolina a little better? I took the worry and I could let it go. From there, amused by how a test could influence my mood, because it certainly did, made me very cheerful for a few days, I began to study other tidbits of information now and then, slowly, a little at a time, reading one report and looking up information to help me understand genomes and chromosomes as I went, as well as the relationship between nature and nurture profiled in some health reports. It's not something you can do all at once. It probably take me years to sort through it and learn the science. By then, they'll know even more. Reading various reports, though, I was struck time and again about the relationship between nature and nurture. Sometimes nature can nudge nurture and vice versa. So much is there inside me, inside you, inside all of us, competing for attention. For example, I can look at a genotype that says I am more likely than the average person to become obese, something I already knew from family history and my mother telling me how to eat from an early age. At the same time that I breathe a sigh of relief over another statistical assertion that says my body type responds well, even better than most do, to exercise. And if I always thought that sugar was not my friend as much as I liked it, there is in my health traits evidence that sugar may be more difficult for me to metabolize. And I know that on my own as well. Because of family history, I had expected to find an increased risk for type 2 diabetes. Yet, curiously, I did not. Or maybe, I thought, that diabetes one branch of my family seems to get is related to the way some of us process calories from different sources, such as sugar and fat. Some people are born to have higher levels of blood sugar circulating despite good efforts. DNA research has allowed research to look more deeply into illness, of course. One genetic glitch does not fit all, not with diabetes or even breast cancer. And so I might pause here and say, if I could, like Hawkins, do it all over again, I might do medical research. I've always thought that would have been a lot of fun. But I have no regrets. 0 regrets. Fortunately, there is a genotype associated with my DNA that says that not only is exercise good, but perhaps I would be good at it if, maybe I'd started years earlier, and also avoided sugar. That I might be good at endurance sports the way my son is. My son's an endurance athlete, something that I always think is a little nuts. I once I saw that at least I, perhaps also he, well, at least I have that a genotype often held by world-class athletes. I thought, well, maybe he's not nuts. Maybe he's just running. So it tickles me to see that trait. And that marker also made me think of the Energizer bunny gene. Even before the DNA test, I used to say I wished I had the Energizer bunny gene or resilience gene. I guess I didn't need DNA proof to realize that my mother had it. So did a great-grandfather who survived being starved and used as a human shield when he was a prisoner of war in the Civil War. He survived all kinds of hardship to live a long life and have some children, one of whom married my mother's father, which allowed my mother to be born, and me and my son. So many of my relatives, generations back, also have lived a long time. Of course, with that, I found the longevity gene marker in my profile. My mother had to have had it too, and most likely perhaps my father. Something some might think is a curse if it comes packaged with dementia. I don't. Every minute of my father's long life and my mother's had meaning. We are not always here to stand up in front of a group of people to reflect on how DNA has helped one small person in a large gene pool to understand herself a little better, or to talk about morphemes to a linguistics class. That's not really why I'm here, although I hope to be doing that sort of thing for a time to come. Genes aside, I know without scientific proof that I am resilient. I've been there my whole life. Think about it, though. As for longevity, the jury is out. Does it seem, I've been asking myself, as if nature is capricious to give somebody who will get cancer or many other things a longevity gene? Perhaps that makes as much sense as giving somebody with an obesity gene the ability to use exercise and diet to her advantage. Really, it gives me hope. Thinking about odd pairings of genes, I've come to reflect on the yin and the yang of it all. I did get cancer, but I have a good immune system, sort of, and have always lived a cancer-savvy lifestyle, short of avoiding toxins that others throw my way because of family history, not the toxins, the lifestyle has influenced, my family history has always influenced my lifestyle choices in all ways, including the fact that I don't drink much. So I could have felt like a failure when I did get cancer. I sort of did. I really did. Yeah, my doctor, when I told him that, made me think that perhaps I held the illness at bay a little longer by behaving responsibly for so many years. I like to think that I delayed the onset long enough for the drug I needed the most to get through clinical trials. My sort of cancer, which involves an elaborate dance between DNA and proteins encoded in some chromosome 17, I think, and I've looked at that chromosome. I don't know what it means, but I've looked at it. Used to be in the raw data. It used to be a death sentence. It isn't today. Even so, I know that I will not live forever. I'm not immortal, thank goodness. But my DNA sort of is, and not just because of what will come after me, perhaps in a petri dish in some lab, or in my great-grandchildren, I think, but also very much because of what came before. We are all full of wonder. We are all so much more than the sum of our parts. Geneticists might call this wonder recombination. Recombination, the way I explain it to myself, means that I'm not simply the sum of my parents' genes. I have some of each, but not 50-50. My father was a genius. I am not. My mother had a genetic eye disorder. I do not carry that gene. After that, my genes turned to each of their parents in various combinations, not necessarily 25, 25, 25, 25, and on down the line. It all gets mixed up. Even though my full brothers and I have the same family lineage all the way back, I have a half brother. We are different people with different health traits and slightly different deep ancestry. Although we share about 50% of our genes, many different genetic codes from time have been encoded in our cells. Parents with their mixed bag of genes are wonderful, if not necessary, because they give us life. They pass on genetic recipes for interesting lives and quirky character traits. Their genes, though, are just a drop in the bucket of the recombination of genes. What our biological parents do, along with everything else, is pass on genes that link us to evolutionary history and cultural revolutions. This deep ancestry makes me feel strong on my own and realize where I fit in a society a little better and realize I'm not alone at all. When I think about how one woman who lived on the African continent trooped up from there, taking not days but decades, ending up in the Caucasus Mountains not decades later but centuries, I have to pause and catch my breath. This is the woman whose mitochondrial DNA I carry, what you might think of as maternal DNA. While I don't know her name, scientists and preachers sometimes call her Mother Eve. Her people were resilient people. They wandered. They survived. They built civilizations. The Caucasus is in that borderland between what we now call Europe and Asia. There we can find Mount Elbrus, the highest mountain in Europe. I have never climbed this mountain, but I think my DNA has. My DNA climbed this mountain and many more as it trooped through half of another continent to settle down in Great Britain before deciding to move to South Carolina and later Virginia. Thinking of how I once recited to my mother the names of her ancestors as she lay on her deathbed, I sat down recently and wrote down the names of the women in this maternal line to create my own sort of prayer. And I haven't got all the names, but this is what I have so far. Felicia, that's me. Audrey, Ruth, Keturah, Virginia, Margaret, Lucy. That's as far as I've gone, but I bet I'll add more. And so I think, what a miracle for me to be here now in Meadowview, Virginia, the child many times removed of a 30,000-year-old DNA haplogroup. My maternal haplogroup, or DNA group, is found all over Europe. That is more common in Eastern Europe and places closer to the Caucasus. My subgroup is curiously both rare and common. The fact that a DNA group can be both rare and common intrigues me. On an intellectual level, I know that it simply means that not all that many people have it anymore, but it can be found here and there all over, not isolated in just one region. On a more soulful level, I'm in awe of this DNA that has allowed itself to migrate all the way into my body, a gift from my mother and her mother and all the way back. Having some idea that so many strong women came before me makes me feel a little stronger, although, of course, I probably already knew that because my parents told me lots of stories. And so I also wonder about those stories. How did woman A get from B to Z? How did woman Z get from R to W? Or how did man B end up marrying woman L? It's all mixed up. Perhaps it's trite to say, but I think it's nothing short of miraculous to be alive today. It has to mean something. That somebody survived probably an attack by a wild animal, many acts of war, religious persecution, all of those things, in order for just one little ordinary person to stand here in front of you today. Usually I say I'm from South Carolina. More and more, I realize I've come from many other places than that. I'm from all over. In fact, I have more than my mother and her interesting DNA and her genes, and my father's interesting DNA and her genes. Let me not forget to honor my Neanderthal genes. Now, my DNA report reveals that I have a higher than average portion of the Homo neanderthalis genome. While that simply means that most of my DNA is Northern European, it sounds sort of profound to me, at least on an evolutionary level. About 30,000 years ago, Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis lived together and interbred, although not everybody agrees that happened. Most Homo sapiens who evolved outside Africa retain some percentage of gene markers associated with the Neanderthal heritage, between 1 and 4%. While my ancestors are mostly Northern European, Europe is a big, big place, and these people are spread across the map, not just in Northern Europe, and so all my deep ancestry is everywhere from Africa to Eastern Europe to Ireland and so on. It's very easy for me to track my Northern European ancestors, less easy to find the African, whose genes began mixing with mine about 8 generations ago, around the same time genes were migrating into my body from Prussia, which is kind of interesting. This little body of mine is indeed a melting pot. Thinking about when various genetic lines have entered my family tree, I've begun to wonder about my relatives, all these people who lived in places on the continent of Africa and Europe and Southeast Asia, Iberia, Italy, Poland, Germany, England, France, Scotland, Ireland, and here in different states, all over the place. And even some more that I have listed here. And that's stuff that, we grow up hearing. It's interesting seeing it written down. I already had a few family trees from relatives who wrote stuff down, including the kinds of things that you don't really see usually on family trees, the little stories in the margins, which are priceless. To explore my roots further, I've started creating my own family tree that includes every branch that I can reconstruct limb by limb. Some branches go back a few hundred years, some more, and it will keep growing because it's fun to play with, like Tinker Toys. When I work with a family tree, I'm inspired to see stories passed down from my parents that I used to listen to, but also sort of tune out. Stories recorded in family and more public histories. So that, I will think, seeing the name of one woman I just recently found is the great-great-grandmother who paddled a canoe across the Congaree River so she could go to the farmer's market. And here are these men who fought in the Revolutionary War here. And then there is Sabina. I love Sabina. I just met her this past week, who married a man in Germany and traveled with him from there to South Carolina via Pennsylvania and the Shenandoah Valley so long ago, and yet close enough to wave to me here in Southwest Virginia centuries ahead of her. What amazing courage these early settlers had to have, migrating onwards. And I have to think, what harm they also had to do. But without Sabina and her pioneering spirit and her husband, I would not be here either. Older now, and I used to find people were into genealogy, so they just drove me nuts a little bit. Well, at least my mother, because they can get so obsessed, as if they want to prove they're related to somebody important. We're all important. Anyway, I see a family tree now not as a way to prove some sort of arbitrary pedigree or to prove that one can join the DAR or colonial dames, but as a way to connect with world history and evolutionary populations. All the people who conspired to give me life in whose lives each and every one were important, no matter how small, as they existed in some community, affecting some small or large change in the transmission of not just genes, but also values and cultural traditions and so on. I think that sentence got away from me. For example, though, there is a little girl named Nellie who is particularly in my mind lately. I found her because one of my uncles never could figure out something about one of my great-grandmothers, and I thought I will put my detective skills to that. In the 1860 census in the U.S., she was living in a small farming community near where I lived as a toddler, near a swamp. And what I sometimes call, this is terrible, the middle of nowhere, South Carolina. Her father farmed, but whenever I go back there, I just feel a primal pull. Anyway, her father farmed. Her mother kept house. Nellie was 10. She could not read and write. She grew up and married and died in childbirth, birthing my grandfather. She's buried with her husband in some woods, stones instead of headstones on her grave. Learning about her, I must learn more about the history of education and the role of women. No wonder my parents were proud of me. And no wonder I should be proud of them for making sure I learned to read and write. On some other branches, though, I do see women who did go to school and college, even in the early days, and who could read and write and do math. I see that not all men were farmers, though so many were. Some were teachers. One was a mathematician. Many were soldiers. Some planted cotton and some picked it, and some ordered others to plant and pick cotton. Along with diverse professions and locations, too, are diverse religions. My ancestors include pantheists, Jews, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, you fill in the blank. It's as if I'm genetically predisposed, I can't say it. I have a genetic predisposition to be drawn to the Unitarian Church, which honors and allows diverse paths. In truth, I've always said that. I've always said, there's something about all this stuff inside me that makes it difficult for me to choose or feel that I should choose one over the other. So I'm going to say I honor the work of all these ancestors as in their lives, even when they did all kinds of things that I wouldn't do and wouldn't encourage others to do, and they did all kinds of wonderful things. And sometimes they didn't do much at all. As I revisit their lives, I will, I hope, learn more about their homes, their cultures, their beliefs, their part in history, their cultural legacies, the way their stories fit into a bigger picture. Genealogy is, I see now, a trip into the history of evolution and the world and people, and it's mesmerizing. In the end, as much fun as the DNA test and research has been, then I have to say that it's the stories of DNA in action, embodied in characters and fascinating stories, that keeps me going back to it. The DNA profile, that's fun, but I like to see it animated. There is a way you can meet current DNA relatives if you do these tests, and I haven't ventured into that. And although I've read some of their profiles, maybe I will do that. But most of all, right now, it's connecting me with the so-called circle of life, and it's made me want to write more poems. And so I wonder, what if eternal life is not out there beyond some pearly gates, but right here inside each of us, infinity at its most mortal, something like an acorn or a mustard seed or a human cell? To be a human is to die, I know. Yet I think I've come this past year that to think to be human, to share genes with other humans from across time, is the closest we'll ever get to tasting a mortal life while we're still living. And that's it. And so I hope you have conversation and questions.